Oh hey! What's good, YouTubers? This is Londononion with another class review and guide for Defiance 2050. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the Crusader class. Now, since there is not just one way to use a given class, the guide portion of this review is consequently debatable and to be taken with 2 grains of salt. The main focus will consequently be on the class skills and the overall combination of skills that may best benefit the user. So the Crusader is the class that was dropped on its head when it was born. It is easily the most unique. Its skills are oriented towards melee and being up close and personal, delivering high damage blows. Anyone that has beaten Halo 2 could simply understand the Crusader as Tartarus. Now, the Crusader class seems to provide 2 types of playstyles: Aggressor and Survivor. This will be a reoccurring theme throughout the guide. Since none of the Crusader skills directly incentivize the use of any purchasable weapons, I decided that SMGs and shotguns best fit the class abilities, and this will become more clear as I break down the class build. The first skill a Crusader starts off with is Hammer Time. Activating Hammer Time equips the user with a large hammer that runs on ego power with a cooldown of 45 seconds. The beauty of the hammer mainly lies in its ability to last as long as the wielder needs, in that there is no finite time to holding the hammer. However, at max level, the hammer contains 200% ego power, and as one strikes, the ego power depletes anywhere between 10 and 25 power, depending on the strike. There are 4 combinations of strikes a Crusader can use: the Standard Strike, the Double Strike, the Charge Strike, and the Jumping Strike. Generally, the hammer is effective against most weak enemies, and will usually require no more than 2 strikes. With the Jumping Strike, virtually all weak and moderate enemies die immediately, and there is an effective range once the Crusader makes contact with the ground, allowing multiple enemies to be eliminated at once. When faced with tougher enemies, the hammer seems to fall flat with virtually no ability to eliminate them quickly or create any means of stunning them. Instead, using the hammer will usually leave the wielder in a very vulnerable position. The only tough enemy I've been able to approach with the hammer are Grid Inquisitors, but even they aren't worth depleting the Hammer Time skill. However, the effectiveness and practicality of the hammer strikes will be discussed closer to the end of this review. So now moving on to the Tier 1 skills. Tier 1 consists of Intimidate, Juggernaut, and Invigorate. The Intimidate perk reduces damage taken by a maximum of 10% and increases threat from the wielder's attacks for 10 seconds. This skill seemed interesting to me at first, but as I had discussed with the Hammer Time skill, the hammer can last as long as the wielder needs, which would likely be a lot more than 10 seconds. Meaning that for every time the hammer is summoned, there is only a 10-second window for a 10% damage reduction. I'm not too aware of the effects of threat, but in testing out this skill, I have not noticed any significant change in performance. Otherwise, the damage reduction can only be substantial when combined with other skills further down the tree. The Juggernaut perk allows 15% of one's health to regenerate upon killing an enemy. This is a very simple perk that would barely be the difference between living or dying, but the cooldown is a mere 15 seconds, meaning that gaining a little bonus in health will be rather frequent and can especially be a small help when getting close to enemies. The Invigorate perk speeds up the cooldown of class skills by a maximum of 20%, after falling below 50% health, that is. This would make an interesting combination if used with Juggernaut, but when the class points are split between the two, both perks become virtually useless, making unnoticeable differences. This is simply a matter of having one's cake and wanting to eat it too, in which this skill tree is very unforgiving. If one wanted to adopt more of an aggressor style, Invigorate would be the best option. For a Survivor Crusader, Juggernaut is the optimal choice. Personally, I prefer to never go down than to kill my enemies faster, but this will be explored further along. For now, I would say the winner is Juggernaut. The first junction of skills for the Crusader is Blitz and Vortex. Blitz propels the Crusader a high and far distance forward. Upon landing, a maximum damage of 160% is applied to all nearby enemies and stuns them for 2 seconds, provided that they survive the first impact. The skill works extremely well against weak and most tough enemies. Weak enemies die immediately, and tough enemies are open to having a substantial amount of health depleted, whether that be with the hammer or other weaponry. With a cooldown of 20 seconds, this can be a frequently used skill. Alternatively, Blitz can also be used as a means of quick evasion, for anyone trying to be a little bit creative. Vortex quite simply draws nearby enemies towards you. However, they can still fire and inflict damage while drawing them closer. Initially, this seems like a dangerous skill to use, but when paired carefully with other skills can be a devastating skill. If one is using hammer time, Vortex will make landing strikes a lot easier, but this will obviously be counterproductive with tougher enemies. Both skills can be used aggressively, but Vortex is purely to an aggressive end. Blitz provides more options: stun and run, stun and devastate, or blitz away altogether. For now, I would say Blitz takes this one. In Tier 2, we have Hardened, Fortitude, and Onslaught. Hardened increases one's vitality by a maximum of 10%. Nothing particularly special. Fortitude reduces armor or shield regeneration delay by a maximum of 15%. Depending on what type of shield or armor one uses, this perk may be either useful or mediocre. Ironclads and Rhinos have the longest delays in repair, while Resparks and Tachyons have the lowest. If using Ironclads and Rhinos, Hardened may be worth more of an investment, as a 15% decrease in shield delay won't be a significant difference. Consequently, Fortitude would most benefit Resparks and Tachyons, allowing one's shields to regenerate even faster than they already do. Onslaught is the only perk that directly affects the damage for the hammer, and does so by a maximum of 20%. This seems to be an enticing perk, but this perk only lasts for 10 seconds after summoning the hammer. One wishing to adopt a more aggressive style may appreciate this perk more than the other two. Functionally, however, increasing the damage of the hammer by only 20% pretty much guarantees that all weak and moderate enemies will die from a single strike, a feat that is already accomplished by a jumping strike, making this perk seem somewhat redundant. Tough enemies are barely affected from a hammer strike, still making their encounters with the hammer equipped dangerous. For survivor players, either Fortitude or Hardened are ideal choices. For a player that wants to increase aggressive potential, Onslaught. Personally, I favor Resparks and Tachyons and prefer to specialize in Fortitude. For Tier 3, the skill pattern is inversed. There are now 2 aggressive skills and 1 survivor: Bulldozer, Grit, and Fearless. Bulldozer creates a maximum damage buff of 8%, but can stack 5 times, creating 40% in damage output for 10 seconds. There is, however, a 5-second cooldown between stacks. When paired with Onslaught and Blitz or Vortex, this can create a massive increase in damage with the hammer equipped. However, use against tough enemies is still limited. One is still vulnerable to attacks, and they are very unlikely to kill said enemy. Grit reduces enemy damage by a maximum of 20% when they fall below 25% health. Fearless increases movement speed by 20%, and provides immunity from being knocked down upon a skill activation for a maximum of 10 seconds. Looking back at earlier skills, pairing Fearless with the other aggressor perks would create a hard-hitting and fortified build, but for a very short period of time. It is possible to split this tier between Fearless and Bulldozer to one's preference. For a survivor build, Grit is likely the better option, provided of course that one has been making the appropriate selections earlier in the skill tree. As I am more in the preference of surviving, I choose Grit. Our final junction sits with Meteor Smash and Bulwark. Meteor Smash summons a meteor at any particular target in your crosshairs, dealing 250% damage. Whatever that means. Upon impact, all nearby enemies will sustain damage. Weak and moderate enemies become easily eliminated with this skill. Tough enemies can stand up to this without a problem, but the damage is substantial nonetheless. Bulwark creates a shield that absorbs all damage for 5 seconds, or until it breaks. Once the time expires, the shield explodes, dealing a maximum of 55% of the absorbed damage back at nearby enemies. For aggressors, the Bulwark may seem promising, but based on my experience with the skill, the shield cannot take too much punishment and will quickly leave an aggressor vulnerable. Additionally, the damage output would not be as high as the Meteor Smash. Anyone taking the Survivor route would find the Bulwark to be useful as a last-ditch effort to sustain one's health. This is especially effective when paired with Fortitude and Respark or Tachyon shields, maximizing survivability and dealing some damage back. Aggressors are best paired with, but not limited to, Meteor Smash. Survivors, however, should remain with Bulwark. Since I am more of a survivor, I prefer the Bulwark skill. In conclusion, going with the aggressor build is highly effective in damage output, but is pretty much good for the first 10 seconds, then goes flaccid until the hammer can be brought up again. The survivor is more sustained, but not as effective in high damage output. My philosophy ultimately being that I can't lose if I don't die. When I covered the Assassin class, I resisted going into a critique, but now I can't resist with the Crusader. So to be honest, the Crusader is a very strange and seemingly underpowered class, even when using a fully aggressive build. Tough enemies feel pretty much impossible to approach. Going full aggressor feels redundant since both weak and moderate enemies can be eliminated without much augmentation from the class skills. Although the hammer is the main weapon of the Crusader, it feels extremely stiff and slow. There seems to be an animation lock. If one double or even triple taps the strike input, they will be stuck from moving until the animation is complete, which can be extremely harmful when up close. Additionally, the hammer may have different strikes, but the only strike that does more damage is the jumping strike. The charged and standard strike do the same damage, making a charged strike completely pointless. The class in general, I think, could use a buff, since none of the skills buff any other weapons. And trying to use the hammer against a Monarch, a Black Lung, or a Great Inquisitor is very high risk and should just be avoided altogether. The class is really only effective against weak and moderate enemies at most. Hence, I chose a build more fit for surviving. The Crusader is interesting, but feels somewhat obsolete compared to other classes. But anyway, that concludes the review. Thank you so much for watching, and you can carry on with your life. Hey, you reached the end of the video. Great job. Now hit subscribe.